So welcome to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a new video series that I've created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants. My name is Patrice Davis, the founder of GrantWin Consulting and the lead trainer for GrantWin Academy. On this channel, I'll shed light on what's happening with federal grant funding, from the funding freeze to agency shutdowns, federal payment systems, what are they? I'll break down what is happening and what's being announced by the Office of Management and Budget. If this topic is something that you find interesting and valuable, please subscribe and comment below because your comments help the YouTube algorithm share this with others who would benefit from this information. USAID is becoming more and more of a household name these days because it is the first agency that's been significantly restructured by the current administration. In just 2 weeks, it's gone from having over 10,000 employees and contractors to reportedly about 611 employees. It's been folded into the State Department with former Senator, now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, appointed as the acting administrator of the agency. The website is gone. And as of today, February 8th, 2025, when I record this, I'm completely unaware of the status of the grants awarded by the agency. But I'm going to explain all of this. So just in case you don't know what USAID, I'm going to have a hard time saying USAID because I've been calling it USAID for years. But just in case you don't know what USAID does, I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of when it was formed, what the agency was charged with doing, the reasons the current administration put forward that, for why they wanted to restructure the agency and where it goes from here. I also have a video snippet from someone who's overseen projects funded by USAID, who also has former colleagues that have been impacted by the recent terminations or leaves and or furloughs. I don't want to call them terminations. We'll stick with calling them leaves and furloughs. Those are the terms that I've seen out in the media. And so she will provide some behind the scenes details and a really good breakdown of what this means for USAID funded projects. As was the case with the very first video in this series, I'm also going to go back to usaspending.gov again to take a look behind the curtain at grants funded by that federal agency or the former federal agency, by USAID in federal fiscal year 2024. And again, the federal fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. If you're a former USAID employee or contractor, I would definitely love to hear about your recent experiences. If you can put them in the comments below. If you're a USAID grantee, I really want to hear from you as well, because I'd love to learn what you've been receiving in terms of communication from USAID before its current status. I say that because we have clients that have grants from other federal agencies, not USAID currently, and some of the communication or lack thereof is leaving everyone scratching their head about their 5, 6, and 7-figure grants from the various federal agencies. Imagine having 5, 6, or 7-figure or even 8-figure federal grant, and you're having to pause projects. You're having to, not just when we say pause projects, it's not the projects. Remember, there are people that carry out the projects. So their positions are up in the air, whether or not they're going to stay on, whether or not they're going to keep the funding, we just don't know. And that's one of the reasons why this is so perplexing for so many people around the world. All right, so I do want to let you know, we're going to start off with USAID history. Again, I always call it USAID. My guests refer to it as USAID, so that's what I'm going to go with. A lot of this information that I'm going to share, I pulled from the Kaiser Family Foundation, from Just Security, from the BBC, from PBS, and even the conservative-leaning publication Washington Times. Again, not to be confused with the Washington Post. But I just wanted, and all of the links from, for some of the places where I received this information will be in the description below. So USAID was created in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy through an executive order as an agency of the State Department under the authority of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. It was then made its own agency within the executive branch as a result of the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998. There's quite a few things that happened between then, so I'll go through that. In 2003, then President George W. Bush, that's the son, he created a long-standing program called PEPFAR. I'm very familiar with PEPFAR, which stands for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And interestingly, he placed PEPFAR with the State Department. It's interesting because the State Department does not actually implement programs. And so PEPFAR itself, the program, has actually been primarily implemented by USAID and the CDC. Under President Obama, USAID received more authority and support. And then, of course, under the President Trump's first term, he made some changes. And then under President Biden, the USAID administrator was given a seat on the National Security Council. And that's a very important point. One important detail to note here is several other countries around the world have their own version of USAID. However, USAID is considered to be the premier international development agency, probably the largest. I can't confirm that. If you know, please drop that in the comments below. But it is the premier international development agency with global health, economic growth, education, agriculture, and other programs that were being implemented around the world. USAID has or had activities and projects in more than 120 countries with field offices in more than 60 countries around the world, with most of the work being carried out by other organizations that are contracted by USAID. So I want to pause to quickly clarify. My specialty is in federal grants, which is a kind of federal financial assistance. When I say contracted, more than likely these are contracts, which is different than federal financial assistance. It's something I always feel the need to clarify because a lot of people aren't aware that there is a difference, very significant difference, and I just wanted to make sure I clarified that here. So a few sample projects under the USAID's Global Development Alliance, and that's just the Global Development Alliance, are the Safe Drinking Water Alliance, the Inclusive Market Alliance for Rural Entrepreneurs in Guatemala, the India Rural Electrification Program, and the Childhood Site Improvement Program in Bolivia. So here's a video of data again from usaspending.gov. I recorded this a few days ago because I wanted to show you, actually I recorded it last night. I remember now. I recorded it after midnight last night because I just really think it's important to try to capture some of this data. I don't know how much of that will change in the coming weeks, but here's a video from usaspending.gov that shows you some of the federal grants awarded by USAID.
So I decided to do a search again on usaspending.gov of all grants awarded in fiscal year 2024. Again, all grants by the Agency for International Development, USAID. And here are some of the recipients of grants according to the information reported in usaspending.gov. At the top is an organization called GAVI Alliance. You can also see the World Health Organization as a recipient of USAID, the Joint United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS. And I'll keep going. The Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins is the 10th largest recipient of grants in federal fiscal year 2024. For those of you who aren't aware, the federal fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. So I just wanted to scroll through and show you some of the organizations that received federal grants from USAID. Family Health International, you see pretty frequent as a recipient of federal grants, and also Research Triangle Institute, also quite a bit of JSI. So I'm going to come out of this area so we can see that $16.98 billion was what was awarded by USAID in fiscal year 2024. So when we hear people say that it was about 1% of the federal budget, this probably gives you some idea, and then shows you the obligations over time. And you can see September 2024, that's the final month of fiscal year 2024. And it looks like states also receive funding from USAID. Sometimes the funds were awarded to organizations within the United States that then subawarded them to organizations in different parts of the world. And I'm familiar with at least one that was based in North Carolina. So I just wanted to give you guys an idea of the funding that was awarded. As you can see, I've only searched for grants, right? Now I'm going to search by grants by recipient type. So nonprofit. So I've added that to the search filter. So as you can see, there's some of the organizations: World Vision, Global Communities, Mercy Corps, Public Health Institute, Catholic Relief Services, World Vision. Just wanted to share some information about grant funding awarded by USAID. We're not going to try to step out of bounds in terms of the things that we want to cover, but I just saw a headline on the news tonight, so I decided to quickly record data that was still available on usaspending.gov.
Now we're going to dig into the current administration, their desire to, and it seems like they have succeeded in dismantling the agency in just 2 weeks. So as you know, the current president does not believe that American taxpayer dollars should be used for foreign aid, and he's called out USAID several times. The White House website actually listed several projects they believe substantiate or support their reasons for wanting to dismantle the agency, including the following projects: $1.5 million to an LGBTQ group in Serbia, $2.5 million for electric vehicles in Vietnam, and $6 million for tourism in Egypt. So I put tourism in air quotes because others know that tourism project is intentionally described in a way to diminish what the project is, because that project in Egypt, according to others, is really for, quote, water, education, and transportation aid projects. You guys can, of course, take a look at it, look for it if you'd like, and verify that information. So almost immediately after he returned to the presidency, the current president signed an executive order that put almost all international spending on a 90-day review with waivers for, quote, I'm going to use air quotes a lot, humanitarian programs. So then the following happened, and this is not a complete list, and this list is of 10 things, but it's not a complete list of what's happened in the past 2 weeks. So there have been continued tweets from billionaire Elon Musk claiming USAID is a criminal organization that must die. I do want to point out that what's being reported on one side is that of an organization that is a cabal that must die, that's done all of these evil things. On the other side, of course, are folks that, fully support the organization and believe that it's doing amazing things around the world. Whenever you want to encourage folks to, quote unquote, get on your side, you're going to use language that is going to best support your position. So I just want you all to be very aware of that as you come across different things in the media. Elon Musk's reps went to USAID along with other agencies, but we're going to focus with you on USAID this time, where tensions apparently escalated that resulted in senior security officials trying to block them from accessing secure data at the agency. One of the things that keeps coming up from folks across, regardless of what your party is, there are people who are concerned, genuinely concerned, that because Elon Musk does not have a security clearance, he's not a federal official, and DOGE, which is the Department of Governmental Efficiency, isn't really a government agency, that his access and the access of the 19 to 25-year-olds that are going with him to these agencies is something that should be alarming. You can decide whether or not you believe it's alarming or not, but those senior security officials were then put on leave, and that's typically what happens when there have been entries into different agencies. As of Friday, February 7th, 2025, over 8,000 other USAID staffers and contractors were put on forced leave or have been furloughed. The U.S. flag was taken down from the building in Washington, D.C. Duct tape has been used to block out the agency's name on a sign outside its Washington headquarters. The current administration says there will be a review of which aid and development programs it will resume, and once resumed, it will be run out of the State Department. Employees that have been posted overseas were given 30 days to return to the U.S. if they chose to. And yes, the government is apparently, or at least reportedly, going to be paying for their travel and moving costs if they return within 30 days. In a notice posted on the USAID website, what's left of it, the federal government noted that workers who chose to stay longer than 30 days might have to cover their own expenses unless they requested and received a specific hardship waiver. Number 10, the American Foreign Service Association and the American Federation of Government Employees filed a lawsuit late Thursday, February 6, 2025, asking the courts in Washington to, quote, compel the reopening of USAID's buildings, return its staffers to work, and restore funding, end quotes. Number 11, I said there were 10 things. There are actually 13. A judge, specifically Judge Carl Nichols, has granted a temporary restraining order to avoid putting 2,200 workers. I'm not sure what the difference is between the 8,000 workers and the 2,200 workers, but the restraining order has been granted to avoid putting 2,200 workers from USAID on paid leave. I guess that's the difference between the paid leave and the furloughed workers and potentially those contractors. I would love to get an understanding of the breakdown, but that temporary restraining order is in place for just a week. Now, according to the Washington Times, House Republicans led by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and Chip Roy introduced legislation to, quote, erase USAID. And number 13, which isn't really related to USAID, but I happened to come across that today and I thought that was very interesting, is that, again, unrelated, but apparently President Trump is said to have revoked President Biden's security clearance. So can the administration do what they did? Can they do what then been done? What they is doing, what they have done? By the way, I'm not making light of this situation. I think I'm just in shock. And so as a federal grant consultant, by the way, I'm used to following the rules, regulations, and laws, and then summarizing those rules, regulations, and laws for our clients. So this is even more mind-blowing for those of us who work in the space. I'm sure it's also really, really mind-blowing for most federal workers and probably a lot of attorneys and auditors, again, who work in the space, or even if they don't work in the space, just to see the very quick dismantling of a whole federal agency. So just wanted to point that out, that all of this is very interesting. And again, is what spurred me to take additional time out of my, my days to just try to make sense of this and communicate what I've learned. So as I mentioned earlier, USAID was created by an executive order based in part by a law, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, and later an act of Congress, the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998, established USAID as its own agency. In that act, the second one, the language is, there is within the executive branch of government the United States Agency for International Development as an entity described in Section 1204 of Title V. So these were words used by Congress to establish the agency. So I do want to double check the sequence of that. I want to make sure the language that I just gave you wasn't really from the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, but I'm almost certain it's from the second act. But you guys can double check that, and I'll also put any corrections down below. Those, again, were words used by Congress to establish the agency. In 1998, President Clinton put into a, quote, statutorily envisioned report that effective April 1, 1999, the USAID shall continue as an independent establishment of the executive branch. Then in a more recent provision of that law, Section 703 of the fiscal year 2024 State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Act, it later incorporated into which was later incorporated into the further Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2024. It explicitly required that, quote, congressional consultation and notification to Congress for reorganizations, consolidations, or downsizing of USAID. It goes on to note that, quote, actions to eliminate, consolidate, or downside USAID or, quote, the United States official presence overseas would not be lawful. I'm hoping this sheds some light on why the current Congress is now introducing legislation to erase USAID. And those were the words used in that Washington Times article. So now we're going to provide some more insight on the impact of what's happened. I'll now introduce you to Kelly Fraser, a person who's managed USAID funded projects and has colleagues impacted by the sudden leaves and or furloughs. So I'm going to just let that video run now, and then I'll come back to provide a little bit more insight on what's happening at USAID. So with me is Kelly Fraser. So Kelly is a member of the GrantWorks team. And so Kelly, I invited you because I knew you would have, some more specific experiences that you could share. Number one, you've actually managed USAID grants. And you have colleagues that worked at USAID. So I thought it would be a great opportunity for you to come and share a little bit more about what is USAID? What are some of the projects that you've managed that were USAID funded, and just some of the experiences that you've learned about what's happened with USAID in the past week and a half?
Absolutely. Definitely happy to dive into all of that. So USAID, or the U.S. Agency for International Development, is an organization, an independent federal agency that implements foreign aid programs across the world. They cover everything from global health, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, and food security to education, democracy promotion, and economic development and poverty reduction.
Mm-hmm.
They represent around 1% of the federal budget, and most of their work is done through implementing partners. So these are organizations that receive grants, cooperative agreements, or contracts from USAID to actually implement that work.
Mm-hmm.
Before joining GrantsWorks, I did work in grant management for a few NGOs in the global health and disaster management sectors. So as you said, I have former colleagues who've gone on to work for USAID. Or who work for some of the non-governmental organizations that are impacted by those recent developments.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad you pointed out something that I didn't know. What that is, that only 1% of the U.S. federal budget is actually committed to USAID. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. And so the savings that the government is trying to make, it's really about, okay, well, so that gives us a better idea of how much the government can expect to save as a result of the folding of USAID into the State Department. I do believe that there were some, policy goals that they had in mind as well. But it's still great to hear from you, someone who has experience with USAID, both projects and team members. So tell me a little bit about what you've heard in terms of, people that have been laid off recently, whether they are contractors or actual USAID staff. Would love to learn a little bit more about what you've learned.
Absolutely. So there's been a number of developments over the last 3 weeks. Most recently, those have focused around a proposal to actually shut down the agency in its entirety and potentially absorb it into the State Department. So what
Mm-hmm.
we've seen over the last couple of days have been actually notices going out to agency staff that they are being placed on leave effective this week. And that's gone over to both the full agency staff as well as contractors and locally employed staff.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a number of personal services contractors that have received termination notices already. And because they're not federal employees, they don't have the same protections. So they are already not working. They represent, by the way, up to 50% of some of those bureaus, like the Bureau for Global Health. So it's a really significant reduction already. And then we'll see at the end of this week that nearly the entire workforce is being laid off.
Yeah, and I remember reading somewhere that I think only about 290 people of the full USAID staff. Now, whether it's staff and contractors, that represented a 10,000 number that I've seen banted around. But the bottom line is there are about 290 people now who are working for USAID. And now it makes me wonder, what is the status of USAID grants? Do you know anything about what has happened to the active grants?
Yeah, so there was, just to back up a little bit, there was an executive order that went out on January 20th, ordering a 90-day pause on all existing grants and contracts for foreign aid funding.
Mm-hmm.
And then about 4 days later, there was a directive from the agency ordering their contracting officers and agreement officers to actually start issuing stop work orders. So the second week of this administration, those stop work orders started going out, and those organizations have been required to pause all of their activities, with a limited exception for humanitarian work. And those So that waiver covers what they call life-saving humanitarian assistance.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to note there's been some question from those organizations as to whether their projects even count as life-saving humanitarian assistance. So even those that are ostensibly covered by the waiver
Mm-hmm.
have been paused in many cases while they're waiting for additional guidance from the agency. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, with many of those staff being laid off, that guidance has not been forthcoming.
So that brings up even more questions. Do we know if USAID has released notices of funding opportunity, or I know there's another way that USAID typically releases funding announcements. If you can clarify the different ways that they release funding announcements. I know we've had a conversation internally at the company about that recently. Do we know funding announcements are out there potentially for those projects that qualify as humanitarian assistance? So I'll let you answer that one first before I move on to my next question.
So I don't believe any funding is going out. In general, those NOFOs have been rescinded,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the APS NOFOs. Those funds are not going out except in very limited cases for, again, that life-saving humanitarian assistance.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the entire USAID website has been pulled down.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to usaid.gov right now, you'll see just a notice to employees about the impending layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
The only other portion of the website that is up right now is for the Office of Inspector General. So
Mm-hmm.
there is no guidance out there for recipients of those fundings or potential applicants at this time.
So one of the things I do want to point out is for those folks who are not familiar with how federal grants work. So typically, an agency releases a notice of funding opportunity. Organizations decide to apply for funding if it's a competitive funding opportunity. The agency, agency officials review the application to determine, okay, which ones we want to fund, and then the organization receives a notice of award and or grant agreement to the organization, letting them know that this is a grant for 4 years, and for 4 years we're going to fund this project. And there are different ways that the additional funding is awarded per year. I wouldn't say additional funding, but the ways that the award is, what's the word? I think it's a continuation. I don't think of the proper term right now, but there are different ways that they make sure that the funds are basically available each year. The organization typically has to prepare both financial reports and programmatic reports, and so what you're saying is every grant, whether it's a 3-year grant, a 4-year grant, or a 10-year grant, I'm not sure how many of those are out there, all of those grants are no longer in effect. They've just been terminated.
Most of them
Okay.
at this time have received a stop work order, and then just today and yesterday, many of them started receiving actual termination notices. So the
Mm-hmm.
stop work order, for anyone who's not aware, is really just an order to pause for now.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, that organization is allowed to incur some limited costs just to keep their office open, but they're not actually allowed to implement the project. And
Mm-hmm.
so more recently, within the last couple of days, those organizations are going from a stop work order to an actual termination order, meaning their grant is completely canceled.
So basically, the U.S. government, and it's so interesting because for the work that we do, we're used to looking at the reasons why a federal agency will terminate a grant, and we're always looking at it from the point of view of whether or not the organization complied. One area that we hadn't really, I don't recall really looking into are the agency just saying, hey, we no longer have the funding for this area, and therefore we're going to stop the funding. I don't think I've ever experienced that. What I've never heard of is an agency just terminating the grant, whether or not the organization was doing well, was carrying out the project really well, whether or not, there are all these different variables that are typically evaluated to determine whether or not a grantee is being successful, but these have just been terminated. So one of the things that we also want to share with the audience is that grants fund salaries, they fund program supplies, they fund equipment, they fund training programs, they fund just a range of activities and expenses. And so all of those are basically, they're gone. They're just kaput. Okay. My other question is around communication. So one of the things that we've noticed, even with our clients, is that an agency started, letting their grantees know, last week, or maybe even before then, we are not allowed to continue communicating with you. We're no more external communication is allowed from our organization until this deeper analysis is done to determine which grants we're going to keep. And this is again communication from other agencies, not USAID. Do you know of any kind of communication that USAID officials were allowed to communicate to their grantees?
So interestingly enough, much of this communication from leadership has actually been coming from the State Department, not from USAID. And I think that's in part because the Secretary of State was recently named the administrator of USAID, which I believe he has then delegated to another individual. But much of that communication that's come out from the State Department has been around the standing down of these agreements. So again, ordering those agreement officers and contracting officers to terminate those awards. The Secretary of State also issued a humanitarian waiver on January 24th, providing exceptions to this pause for life-saving humanitarian assistance. But there hasn't been much clarification as of yet as to what specifically that means. So individual organizations have been trying to get additional information from their agreement officers and their contracting officers as to how their programs can move forward. They're being directed in some cases to the State Department. And again, with all of the USAID staff being laid off at this point, there won't be any further communication coming from them for the most part.
Yeah, yeah. And so for the audience, I do want to also point out that USAID went from a functioning agency with X number of employees, thousands of projects all over the world. Some projects doing life-saving work, and just all the things that Kelly described, all the different areas where they work, to being reduced to a 290 person, I would say, team, if you want to call it that, or what's left of USAID. It's very, as I said before, there's just a feeling of destabilization, and we certainly understand that that is probably the intent. And just really thinking about all the people, not just the USAID employees, but the people that were employed by the projects that were funded by USAID. All of those people are now out of a job, with the exception of the 290 that we're aware of. And they received, and this all happened within really a week. Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? Any personal experiences? What are some of the things that your colleagues plan on doing? I do remember we had a conversation and you pointed out many of the people who worked at USAID, they specialized in global health or maybe global development or something related to global work. And so there aren't that many places other than maybe foundations or other, NGOs themselves that are doing the work. So I would love to get some more insight on the impact on individuals.
Absolutely. So just to give some further background, in my own career, I worked on global health grants funded by USAID, as well as other US government agencies that are still up and running. I've also worked on projects funded by private foundations, individual donors, UN agencies, and foreign governments, in fact, like the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office from the United Kingdom. So with the exception of USAID, those are still up and running, though it's important to note that USAID is one of the largest funders of humanitarian and global health work across the world. So for the most part, those individuals who are leaving USAID or their NGO is shutting down because they no longer have funding, they're now flooding the workforce. They're trying to find other opportunities, either with some of those other donors or projects funded by those donors or the United Nations. But in fact, many of them will end up leaving the industry. And so unfortunately, even if these programs do restart in the future, the global health workforce has been significantly diminished. And it's likely that this will impact those types of programs for a very long time.
Absolutely. And we also have to, and one of the things I'm always thinking about, the mom or dad that who relied on the salary so that they can send their child to maybe school or to daycare. So this does have ripple effects. And so just wanted to make sure that we all think about that while we may be approaching it from a, you know, policy point of view or maybe certain political point of view. The fact of the matter is that once termination is happens, that does indeed impact obviously household incomes and then all the impacts from that. So I do want to thank you, Kelly, for your time. I didn't know if you wanted to end by sharing any additional information about USAID and really what's happened over the past week or two.
Yeah, just for anyone who's listening who might not be aware, I do also just want to share, despite some of the rumors that are out there about USAID funding, the truth is that they do provide life-saving work. And having worked on the grant management side of these programs, I can definitely say that they have the most stringent compliance requirements and oversight of any funder that I've worked with.
Mhm.
All USAID funding is subject to uniform guidance, including both US and non-US based organizations. USAID has additional regulations that apply to their programs. So, it's really unfortunate to see that this is being politicized. But the reality is that these are some of the most well-run programs in the world.
Awesome, awesome. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that USAID grants, of course, are governed by uniform guidance. For those of you who don't know, uniform guidance is a federal guidance, across the board federal guidance that's released by the Office of Management and Budget that directs how federal grants and cooperative agreements need to be managed. And as she pointed out, USAID also has additional guidance because there's so many other things that they need to make sure that they are monitoring. So, uniform guidance may properly address grants that are managed maybe in the United States. Well, with USAID, there are all these other concerns because now they're working globally, and so they're other considerations that they have to keep in mind when it comes to making sure that their grantees and other partners are compliant with the requirements of the funding. So thanks again, Kelly, for your time and for shedding some light on what's happening at USAID. Once this ends, if you can stay on, guys, I'm going to round out this video where I provide a little bit of information about what happened with USAID. Stick with us. I did want to make sure that I brought someone on who can give us some more inside knowledge. And again, thank you, Kelly, for your time.
Thank you.
So what happens now with USAID or for USAID? My answer is I don't know. We have a restraining order. We have an agency that's been significantly whittled down from 10,000 person organization to now, I believe it's 611, if I remember those numbers correctly. It's been supposedly folded into the State Department with the Secretary of State saying that he is the acting administrator. I have no idea what's happening with the grants and or contracts that USAID funded, but I'll be watching this just like you are watching it. I do want to thank Kelly Fraser again for that background information. I do think it's important to kind of make sure that we see the human impact, so to speak. I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about that human impact. We do have to remember that these people, even though many of these people who yes, received paid leave, they now are trying to scramble to find out what their next career move is going to be. If they have children, how they're going to pay for childcare. Whether they're paid or not, they still have to think long term about what's going to happen. If they have children in school, especially if it's private education, have to figure out what they're going to do to pay for that. They're more than likely going to pull back on their spending. What is the impact that all of these furloughs and forced leaves are going to have on this economy? And certainly what's happening around the world, but what's going to happen to this economy? What happens to, it's just a lot of questions. And this is why, these kinds of massive changes over a few short days can result in just a lot of uncertainty. But as I mentioned in the first video of this series, I also managed USAID funding. It was a sub-grant that funded 2 projects that helped to treat 2 specific neglected tropical diseases. It was a short-term life of project role. And for those of you who may not know, sometimes when you work on a grant, when you have a grant-funded position, you are typically notified in the job description that you apply to that, hey, this is a grant-funded position. The grant is active for 2 years. We don't know what's going to happen after 2 years, but we, obviously want to make sure you know that it's grant-funded. So that's why I say a life of project. In other words, the life of the funded project. I do recall that during and after that role, I wanted to learn a little bit more about foreign aid for myself. So I found myself reading articles for and against foreign aid, and I even read a book by Dambisa Moyo. The name of her book is Dead Aid. I became really fascinated by her as an economist. I watched her TED Talk and her debate against or with Microsoft founder Bill Gates and others. So if you're interested in hearing the other side or the other argument for foreign aid, or against foreign aid, you can certainly listen to that. The reason why I'd like for you to take a listen to that is because I think a lot of the, information that's out there against foreign aid is really hyperbolic, and, it's reduced to, evil projects, CIA front, and some of these other words that are used intentionally to convince you that what that side is doing is something that you should support. And of course, on the other side, you have others that may not see foreign aid in the way that a lot of even some of the recipient countries view that aid. So, you do your own homework. But if you want to learn more about the position of those against foreign aid programs, specifically those to Africa, that's a great book to read. I can't say what her position is now, but the book definitely laid out her case. Again, if you found this video valuable, please comment below and share it as far and wide as possible. And don't forget to subscribe. If you have anything to add that I didn't cover, drop it in the comments. Also, check out the links to learn about my consulting firm, GrantWorks, and to learn about GrantWorks Academy, including our federal grant funding and management training series, because federal grants are still here. They're still around. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware that, federal grant funding opportunities, and there are, of course, still federal grants that have not been impacted so far by some of the really sudden changes that are happening. I do want to remind you that particular training is CFRE and GPCI certified with other certifications underway. So I hope this helped you understand a little bit more what's happening with USAID. My goal for each one of these videos is to try to learn as much as I can, summarize it, try to be objective, and then present it in a way that takes you from, the beginning to the end, understanding that the end isn't really here because these changes are happening on a daily basis. I am recording this video on Saturday, February 8th. So by the time you watch this, things may have changed again. But thanks again for spending some time to learn a little bit more about USAID with me. Again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.